I've been fishing alone in the waters near Whittier for over 15 years. I've seen it all. Storms that make you think the boat will flip, huge fish that come out of nowhere, things no one would believe. But that night, I felt something was wrong from the start. The wind was still. The sea looked way too calm, almost dead. When that happens, I always get a bit wary. Silence on the sea is weird, unsettling. There's usually always some sound, even if it's just the water hitting the boat. But that night, nothing. It was like the sea was holding its breath. I was a good distance from the shore, with a few catches already in the boat, just hoping to fill my bucket before heading back. When I pulled the line, I leaned over to check the hook, but I saw something strange in the water. It wasn't just the reflection of the boat or the stars. Underneath, almost like the shadow of a world of its own, I saw what looked like a city. I couldn't make it out clearly, just a jumble of old structures, blocks of stone, like ruins. I blinked and thought maybe I was just tired, but it was still there, unmoving, like it was waiting for me. As I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, the air around me went cold, in a way that chills you to the bone. It was bizarre. I was sweating with fear, but at the same time, goosebumps ran up my arms as if I were in the middle of a snowstorm. I tried to pull back from the edge of the boat, to look away from that city that seemed to be calling me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the clearer the reflection became in the water, and I felt stuck. That strange reflection began to take shape, getting sharper, and I saw tiny points of light appearing among the ruins, like lanterns glowing below. Then I heard my name, but it wasn't just any voice. It was familiar. I recognized it right away, even though I didn't want to believe it. It was Joao, a childhood friend who used to fish with me until he disappeared in a boating accident years ago. His voice was weak, kind of muffled, but it was Joao, unmistakably. But Joao was dead. He drowned right here, in these waters. His voice called my name again, and I felt my heart race because suddenly, it wasn't just him. More voices joined, all familiar, people I knew who had drowned around here at one time or another. The voices were whispering my name, one by one, in a tone that was both desperate and inviting, as if they wanted me to come to them. And as I listened, the lights in the submerged city grew brighter, more intense. It was like those ruins down there had woken up. I couldn't look away. I felt a strange urge to jump into the water, a pull that made no sense, but that kept growing inside me, like an itch that was impossible to ignore. Joao's voice kept saying he was waiting for me, and I knew, deep down, that it wasn't really my friend down there, but something using his voice to lure me in. I tried to step back, to shake off the absurd idea of wanting to jump, but my legs felt frozen. I can't explain it. The submerged city seemed to have some sort of power, pulling me in. Before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the boat, leaning over the water. I looked down into the reflection and felt a cold shiver down my spine. I couldn't see my own face anymore, just the ruins below and the lights flickering. An invisible hand seemed to be pulling my body forward, like the water itself wanted to swallow me whole. I tried to fight that feeling, but it was useless. I felt like invisible hands were gripping my shoulders, pushing me forward. Every time I tried to resist, the pressure got stronger. And the worst part, the voices grew louder, almost deafening, whispering, screaming my name, begging me to jump in. The dark water reflected that city so clearly, like I was staring straight into another world. And then, I saw faces. Faces of people I'd known over the years, people who had passed away, now staring up at me from beneath the surface, with empty expressions, wide eyes, and mouths open like they were screaming underwater. That's when I felt something grab my ankle. It was a cold, wet touch, but strong, like something really had a hold of my leg, trying to pull me down. I thrashed, trying to break free, but it felt like the harder I struggled, the stronger it became. My entire body was in a panic, my heart racing, but my mind was foggy. It was like a part of me wanted to stop resisting, just to end it all and finally find out what was down there. Just as I was about to give in, a flash of clarity hit me. I forced my body backward with all the strength I had left, almost falling onto the boat's deck. The grip on my ankle vanished instantly, and the silence returned. But it was a heavy silence, like something had withdrawn back into the depths, waiting for another chance. I was gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The city's reflection disappeared from the water as soon as I stepped back, leaving only the dark sea, as if none of it had been real. But as I tried to calm my breathing, I looked down at my ankle, and the fear froze my blood. There were finger marks, dark and bruised, like something had actually grabbed me. I couldn't move for a few minutes, just staring at those marks and feeling the cold wind that had finally started to blow again. I knew that if I'd hesitated for just a second longer, I would have been dragged down into that strange world, trapped with the souls that lingered below. I sat on the deck, unable to believe what I'd just gone through. I looked around, searching for any sign that someone else was out there with me, but all I saw was the empty sea around me. The thought of rowing back to shore felt impossible. The feeling of being watched still hung in the air, like the souls that had called me were still watching, waiting for me to make a wrong move. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the oars, and every time the water rippled, I thought I saw shadows moving beneath the boat. Eventually, I managed to gather enough strength to start rowing, but the fear didn't leave me. With each stroke, it felt like the city was just below me, following along, mirrored in the depths. The voices were gone, but the image of those ruins and those faces staring up at me was still vivid in my mind, like a scar. I don't know how I made it back to the shore, but when I finally saw the small harbor lights, I felt a relief I'll never forget. I jumped out of the boat before even tying it up properly and ran away from the water, as if it could pull me back in at any moment. To this day, I've never been able to fully understand what happened that night. I told the story to a few fishermen around here, but most of them just laughed it off, saying it was all in my head, a hallucination from being tired. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt. That submerged city, those voices, the grip on my ankle, it was real. I haven't gone night fishing since then, and honestly, I can hardly stand being near the water alone. Every time I try, I feel like something's watching me, waiting for me to get too close again. The strangest part is, I've recently heard other people mentioning similar experiences in the same area. Fishermen who've seen strange reflections and heard voices of people long gone. It seems like no one really wants to talk about it, maybe out of fear of sounding crazy, or maybe because deep down, everyone knows these waters hold something that's better left alone. I never found an explanation. All I know is that night, I felt death pulling me into the depths, and I only escaped by a hair. I've always been the kind of person who chases after the unexplained. You know, that curiosity that makes you go into places where nobody else would dare. And that's exactly what led me to an isolated village in Alaska, almost forgotten by time, to record the so-called Arctic mist. Ever since I heard about this fog that seemed alive, I became obsessed. I did some research, spoke to a couple of locals online, and the little they told me only fueled my curiosity. It's not safe, they said. No one comes back the same. Of course, that only made me want to go even more. When I finally reached the village, I noticed the place already had a heavy atmosphere, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It felt like no one even wanted to look at me. It was strange, but I thought maybe it was just my paranoia. The mist I'd come to investigate was just beyond the mountains, and it was thicker and darker than I'd imagined. I grabbed my camera, an audio recorder, and started heading toward the fog. At first, it was just a bit cold and dead silent. I could hear my own footsteps crunching in the snow, but something felt like it was watching me. Even without seeing anyone, it was like I could feel eyes on the back of my neck. As I walked further into the fog, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It wasn't just a simple fear of getting lost in thick mist. It was something that messed with my instincts, like this fog had a presence of its own, a consciousness. After a few steps, I started noticing that the sound of my footsteps was different, echoing strangely, blending into the heavy silence around me. I looked back a few times, but the village had completely disappeared, and all I could see was this choking gray. My flashlight barely lit a few steps ahead, making the feeling of isolation even worse. That's when I heard the first sound, a muffled scream, like it was coming from far away. At first, I thought it could be some wild animal, but the intensity and tone sounded human. That sent a chill down my spine. It was a desperate scream, like someone was in danger. I stood there for a few seconds, my heart pounding, trying to decide if I should go forward or turn back. But before I could make a decision, I heard another scream, this time closer. The voice seemed to come from all directions, and, strangely, it sounded like it was whispering my name. My mind started racing, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe the wind was carrying the sound from somewhere, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the stronger the whispers became. They weren't just random screams anymore. Now, I could hear soft voices, like they were all around me, calling my name in a gentle, almost intimate way. It unsettled me in a way I can't explain, a mix of fear and fascination. But what really pushed me to the edge was realizing that every time I tried to walk away from the whispers, the mist seemed to guide me back, like it was blocking my escape, always pulling me toward its center. I started to walk faster, almost running, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being trapped kept growing, along with the certainty that I was being pulled to a specific place. And at the same time, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just vague calls now. I could make out short phrases, almost incomprehensible, like the voices knew exactly who I was, what I was doing there, what I was thinking. The feeling was suffocating. It wasn't just the fear of being lost anymore. It was the terror of knowing that something in that mist knew me and seemed to be toying with me. I tried to take a deep breath and focus, thinking that maybe I was losing my mind. But with each step I took, each time I changed direction, I ended up right back in the same spot. It was like the mist was trapping me on purpose, swirling around me, leaving me with no way out. The weirdest part was that the ground seemed to shift under my feet, making my steps echo in this strange, distorted way. I started shouting, calling out for help, but my own voice seemed swallowed by the fog, muffled, like the mist was absorbing every sound. And then, out of nowhere, I heard someone whisper right next to my ear. The chill that ran down my spine was so intense I almost fell backward. The voice was low, whispering something I couldn't quite understand, but it felt familiar, like an echo of my own thoughts. I spun around in every direction, desperately searching to see something, anything, but the fog was impenetrable. I felt helpless, at the mercy of something I couldn't see or understand. The fear was now physical. I could feel my heart pounding, sweat dripping down despite the freezing Alaskan cold. At that point, any sense of logic or rationality was gone. I was in complete panic. I started running aimlessly, stumbling over the snow, ignoring any sense of direction. I just wanted out of there. With each step, it felt like the voices got closer, and now they weren't just whispering my name. I heard soft, mocking laughter and some broken phrases, like they were trying to say something, but always out of reach. The feeling of being surrounded was overwhelming. I kept thinking I saw shadows flickering at the edge of my vision, but every time I looked directly, there was nothing. After a while, my legs started to give out, and my vision was blurred from sheer terror. It felt like I was going in circles, and the mist grew thicker. The camera in my hand was shaking, and honestly, I didn't even know if it was recording anymore. In a final act of desperation, I started shouting again, begging for help, but the only response I got was the sound of my own voice distorted by the mist. And then, suddenly, everything went silent. The voices, the whispers, gone. That absolute silence was even worse than the whispers. It was like all life around me had been drained. leaving just me and the mist, like we were in some sort of silent standoff. I felt this strange weight on my shoulders, a pressure that made me stop, almost paralyzing me. I tried to move again, only to realize my feet wouldn't respond. It was like something was holding me in place. I looked around, desperate, and swear I could see vaguely human figures emerging in the mist, moving slowly around me without making a sound. On the edge of panic, I closed my eyes, hoping it was just some illusion from my already exhausted mind. But when I opened them, they were still there, standing still, watching me. With one last burst of energy, I managed to move my legs and stumbled backward a few steps, only to feel something cold brush against my hand. That's when I lost control. I dropped the camera on the ground and ran, not looking back, just focused on getting out. I ran until my legs were numb, until the mist finally started to clear, gradually revealing the mountains from where I had come. When I finally got out of the mist and saw the village in the distance, my whole body was shaking. I didn't know if it was from the cold or pure terror, but I felt like I just escaped something way beyond my understanding. Only when I got close to the first few houses did I realize that my camera was gone. It must have fallen back there, but honestly, the last thing I wanted was to go back into that fog. I was even scared to look behind me, like something might be following me. The few villagers still outside gave me strange looks when they saw me coming, like they already knew what I'd been through. But nobody asked any questions. They just went inside their homes, closing their doors, making the place feel even more deserted. I got into my car and drove away as fast as I could, not looking back, with that heavy silence still clinging to me. To this day, I have no idea what that mist was or what was in there. All I know is that, since then, I've been having nightmares about those silhouettes, and I always wake up with the feeling that, somehow, they're still watching me. I started my day like any other on the Alaskan trails. I've always lived for these moments in nature, and there's not much that scares me out here, especially since I know every corner of the territory where I hunt. However, Death Valley has always had a certain reputation among the locals. Stories from other hunters about strange sounds and a heavy feeling in the air. I never paid much attention, to be honest, but I have to admit that as I passed through there that morning, I felt an unexplainable chill. The forest was too quiet, and anyone who knows these trails understands that silence is never a good sign. Still, I moved forward, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The day went on, and hunting was scarce, which was already making me uneasy. But as the afternoon turned to dusk, I saw something I can't forget to this day. A cluster of floating lights. They were just ahead, right in the heart of the valley. At first, I thought it could be a reflection, maybe even a distant campfire, but the lights didn't behave like anything I'd seen before. They had a soft, almost ethereal glow, hanging in the air in a way that didn't seem natural. Even with all my experience, I found myself mesmerized by the sight. Gradually, curiosity began to take over. The more I watched the lights, the more it seemed like they were forming a sort of path, a trail right through the valley. You know that feeling when something seems to be calling you? That's exactly how I felt. After so many years out here, I thought I knew every inch of this region, but these lights were something new, something I'd never seen or heard about. I decided to follow, thinking at the very least it was an interesting natural phenomenon that I could talk about later. I took a few steps toward the lights, keeping my hand close to my rifle, just in case. As I went deeper, something strange started happening. The environment around me began to shift, almost imperceptibly. First, the trees seemed denser, as if they were closing in around me. Then, the ground, which had been firm, started feeling more unstable, with each step sinking a bit into the earth. I looked back and realized I was much farther off my original path than I'd thought. A chill ran down my spine when I noticed I couldn't see the way I had come anymore. Like the valley had turned into some kind of labyrinth. That's when I began to feel truly uneasy. The valley, which had always been a deserted and silent area, now seemed to come alive around me. The absolute silence had given way to a low, constant sound, a kind of whisper that I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Those lights were still floating ahead, as if they were guiding me, pulling me deeper into the valley. Logic told me to turn back, but something was pushing me forward, a strange curiosity that I couldn't shake. And, to be honest, it felt like the path back had disappeared, like the way was blocked to any attempt at retreat. After some time following the lights, I noticed a hooded figure standing on the trail, just watching me. I tried to focus my vision, but the dim light made it hard to make out details. The figure was tall and completely still, entirely covered by the hood, and as I stared, it seemed to be whispering something, words that mingled with the wind and the low sounds that were coming from all directions. My survival instincts finally kicked in, and I decided it was time to get out of there. But when I tried to move back, I realized the path looked different. The dense vegetation, which I was sure wasn't there before, blocked my way, and each step backward felt like I was being pulled back into the valley. At this point, my heart was racing. The hooded figure was still there, motionless, but I could feel it watching me closely. I wanted to shout, to challenge it, and demand it leave me alone. But I knew it would be pointless because that presence didn't seem human. It felt like it was waiting for me to make a mistake, a wrong move. So, with no other choice, I kept trying to back away, but every time I took a few steps, the valley seemed to close in tighter around me. The trees, the shadows, even the air itself seemed thicker, more suffocating. The feeling that I was being lured into some kind of trap became impossible to ignore. For a moment, I stood completely still, trying to organize my thoughts and figure out a way out. I looked around, searching for any familiar landmark, but the scenery had changed so much it felt like an entirely new place. The lights were now farther away, as if they had drawn me to where they wanted me and were now just watching from a distance. And in that desperate moment, I started to hear the whispering again. Only this time, it was much closer, almost right in my ear. A raspy, low voice, saying things I couldn't understand but that felt like an invitation, something calling me to keep going forward. My mind started to panic, but I tried to cling to what little rationality I had left. I took a deep breath and decided that no matter what those lights or that hooded figure wanted, I wouldn't give in. It was time to fight against this sense of control the valley seemed to have over me. I turned in the opposite direction of the lights, forcing my way through the vegetation without looking back. But with every step I took, the ground seemed to shift under my feet. What had been solid earth began to feel like quicksand, making it harder to move and pulling me forward, back toward the lights. Then I caught a glimpse of the hooded figure again, only this time. It was ahead of me, closer, almost blocking my path. It seemed to be waiting, with that heavy silence that made the air around feel frozen. My instinct screamed at me to run, but for some reason, my legs wouldn't move. A deep fear took hold of me, a kind of terror I had never felt before. And as I struggled to force myself to take a step, I realized the whispering had stopped. Everything was in absolute silence, like even the valley was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. Finally, I managed to gather my strength and took a step backward, trying to distance myself from the figure. But the second I did that, the lights began moving rapidly around me, forming a circle that trapped me. They glowed with an almost hypnotic intensity, but now there was nothing beautiful or mystical about them. They were threatening, and their brightness seemed to deepen my disorientation. I tried to find any gap in the lights to escape, but they surrounded me relentlessly. The hooded figure moved slowly in my direction, as if it had all the time in the world and knew I had nowhere left to run. At this point, I realized the valley wasn't going to let me leave so easily. My body was frozen with fear, and all I could think about was how it had all been a mistake. I should never have followed those lights. I tried to remember the path I had come from, but my mind was foggy, as if a haze was blocking my memories. It felt like the place itself was draining my strength, my thoughts, trapping me in a way I never could have imagined. In one last effort, I closed my eyes and started running, not caring about direction or path. I just wanted to get out of there, no matter what lay ahead. I could feel the trees scratching my face, branches snagging on my clothes, but I kept going, each step feeling harder than the last. I ran without stopping, heart pounding, trying to leave behind those lights and that figure, but it felt like the valley kept stretching and folding around me, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I tripped and fell. The fall made me open my eyes, and the absolute silence had returned. The lights were gone, and the hooded figure had disappeared too. I looked around and realized I was in a familiar spot, a clearing I remembered passing through earlier, but now everything seemed normal again. The air was still, and all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing. I slowly got up, still trying to understand what had just happened, but a chill ran down my spine. I didn't know if the valley had really let me go, or if all of this was just the beginning of something that would haunt me. Since then, I've never gone back there. I knew that going alone to the abandoned Anchorage psychiatric hospital wasn't the best idea, but my curiosity was always stronger than my sense of caution. This place had a bizarre history, with rumors of secret experiments from the 1950s, and I wanted to see with my own eyes what remained of that dark past. As I crossed the rusty gate and stepped onto the grounds, I felt a heaviness in the air, a strange weight that seemed to cling to me. The building was dark, with broken windows and peeling walls, and the wind made a low, unsettling sound as it passed through the gaps. Still, I decided to keep going, flashlight in hand and my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just another empty building. The silence hit me as soon as I stepped inside. It was a thick, heavy silence that felt wrong, like the whole building was waiting for something. I started walking down the hallways, looking at the details on the moldy walls and the leftover furniture scattered around. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, a slow, dragging sound coming from somewhere to my left. I stopped and held my breath, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. There was no one there, or at least there shouldn't have been, but that sound was so real that my instinct told me to look around, scanning the empty hallway in front of me for any sign of movement. I kept walking, but that feeling that someone was there with me wouldn't go away. Every step I took seemed to be matched by another, lighter, slower step coming from somewhere in the shadows. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an echo or maybe the wind, but I wasn't convinced. That's when I noticed strange symbols on the walls, almost like they'd been drawn with something dark, maybe soot. The shapes were twisted, some looked like eyes, others like warped figures. I even brushed my hand over one of them, but it felt like it was part of the wall, as if it had always been there. I moved forward, and the footsteps grew louder, now sounding like they were coming from every direction. The entire place started to feel smaller, as if the hallways were closing in around me. When I tried to open a door to get back to the main corridor and maybe find my way out, the handle wouldn't budge, like it was locked from the inside. My heart started racing. I went to the next door, but it was the same. It was as if the hospital didn't want me to leave. Then, I heard a loud, repetitive banging sound coming from the hallway just ahead. As I got closer to where the noise was coming from, I saw a door opening and closing on its own, like someone was pushing and pulling it over and over again. I stopped before getting too close, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the silence around me was so deep that every small sound felt overwhelming. I took a deep breath and took a step forward, and then the door stopped, slowly closing, as if it knew I was there. The flashlight shook in my hand, and I struggled to convince myself to keep going. I'd been to other creepy places before, but this was different. When I finally reached the door, I tried to open it slowly, trying not to make any noise. On the other side, there was just a small empty room covered in dust, but the air felt strange, too cold for a sealed room. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, I noticed a shadow quickly moving across the corner of the room. My heart nearly stopped. I turned the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. Just an emptiness, but the kind that makes you feel like you're definitely not alone, like something's watching you from close by. With no other choice, I decided to leave that room as quickly as possible and continued down the hallway. But now, the footsteps and whispers sounded even closer, almost following me. I tried to ignore it, focusing only on finding an exit, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Suddenly, I came across another symbol on the wall, but this one was bigger and more detailed, almost like it had been freshly drawn. It was a circle with several twisted lines, and somehow, it felt like it was meant to communicate something, maybe a warning or some kind of mark left on purpose for anyone who entered. I kept walking, now trying to ignore the sounds and focus only on finding my way back, but it felt like the hospital was playing tricks on me. The hallways seemed to multiply, and every turn I made led to a place I didn't recognize. I started sweating, feeling a cold dread settle over me. The flashlight was flickering every few seconds, leaving me in near total darkness, and each time the light came back, I swore I could see shadows moving around me. My panic was building, and I knew that if I didn't find a way out soon, I'd be trapped there forever. I decided to speed up, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was following me. Every time I looked back, I saw only the empty hallway, but I was sure something was moving in the shadows, always just out of reach of the flashlight. When I finally found a staircase leading downstairs, I almost ran toward it, hoping it would lead me to an exit. But as I descended, the sound of footsteps continued, now louder and clearer, as if something was coming down the stairs right behind me. When I reached the ground floor, I looked ahead and saw the entrance door I'd come through. I ran toward it, but with every step, it seemed to get farther away, like some kind of nightmare. Suddenly, I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw a dark figure standing right in front of the exit. Its eyes were completely black, empty, but locked onto me, and for a moment, it felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I looked around for another way out, but now shadows were everywhere, closing in on me, slowly blocking off any escape. With nowhere else to go, I started backing up, trying to put distance between me and the figure, as well as the shadows moving closer. My breathing was heavy, and the cold around me seemed to grow, like the very air was draining my energy. Every step I took backward, those black eyes kept following me, empty and unrelenting. Suddenly, I felt something against my back. It was a wall. I was cornered, with those shadows just inches away. The flashlight was shaking so much it barely lit anything. But in one brief flash, I saw the shadows were almost touching me. In a last desperate moment, I shut my eyes, hoping it would all just stop. And then, everything went silent. I opened my eyes slowly, terrified of what I might see. But, to my shock, the hallway was empty. The shadows were gone, and the door was open, like nothing had ever happened. I stumbled out of there without looking back, and to this day, I still can't explain what I saw or heard in that hospital. All I know is that something in that place was alive, something that should never have been disturbed.